Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Chicanery. I am your host, Danny, and it is just me for this episode. Just doing things a little bit different, timing and so on and so forth, but we should be resuming service as scheduled for the Indy 500 and Monaco Grand Prix episodes when those drop here fairly shortly, probably in about a week and a half by the time you listen to this episode. But we do have a race before to cover, and that is, of course, the Emilia-Romagna Grand Prix, which, of course, it's worth noting that is not at all its full name. I can't be bothered to remember what its full name is. But without further ado, let's get into it.
Hey folks, what's going on? It's your favorite Carl from the Victory Lane Vibes crew, taking a little bit of time out of our show here to talk to you about something that's really important. It's the month of May, which only means one thing. You guessed it, it's my birthday. Actually, that's not what I'm here to talk to you about, but keep that in mind. With it being the month of May, one of the biggest, if not the biggest, racing events in North America, heck, even the globe, takes place right in Indianapolis. That's right, I'm talking about the Indianapolis 500 taking place at the end of this month. And so there would be no better way to kick off the month leading up to one of the biggest racing events in North America than with our good friends over at Homefield Apparel. Now, if you don't know who Homefield is, they are a vintage collegiate apparel design company. They've got merchandise for over 80 collegiate sports teams, and this year they've gotten into the world of motorsports. Now, earlier this year they kicked it off with the Hendrick Motorsports collection that's still on their website. Go ahead and check it out. But this month they're launching the Indy 500 collection, and they have some stout pieces. Let me tell you, they launched it last week. I went ahead, I rushed over to the website. I got the 1969 Indy 500 trucker hat, which I had to have, of course, because I'm a trucker. They have all sorts of great pieces, great designs, and great quality. That's one of the best parts about what Homefield does, right? It's not copy and pasted. It's not some, snatched off of Google Images or anything like that. These are authentic and original designs done to the highest of quality. And the best part is they ain't gonna break the bank either. Like, sometimes you get this vintage apparel from these places, you're spending $50, $60, $70. At Homefield, you're not gonna break the bank. They got a website and a mobile app you can check out. Now that website is homefieldapparel.com. You can go over there, you can view the Indy 500 collection, you can view the Hendrick Motorsports collection, you can even view all their other designs. It's all very easily laid out for you to see. They got really fast shipping too. Like I said, I just ordered that hat and it's on its way here. And hey, if you find something you like, you can actually use our code VLV24 for 15% off your first order. Again, that code is VLV24, and the website is homefieldapparel.com. They also have a mobile app in the App Store, whether it's Android or iOS. You can go and check them out. And hey, when you get it, tag us at Twitter, VLVPod. We would love to see what you got. Thank you guys so much, and enjoy the rest of the show.
So, getting to kind of the pre-race stuff. To start out, of course, when we last left off of the F1 circus, Adrian Newey had confirmed his departure from Red Bull Racing. Of course, there were lots of ifs, ands, and buts in the air. What was he going to do? Where was he going to go? How long of a break was he going to take after his pseudo-gardening leave when that ends in Q1 2025? Lots of questions. And Adrian purposely sort of dead-batted away a lot of those to try to leave the door open for future. Talked about wanting to go sailing around the world with his wife. Of course, if you've sort of paid any attention to Adrian over the last, really about 20, 25 years, he loves him some boats. So I know that was put forth as kind of a thing, talking about just enjoying his time because his children are grown, so on and so forth. So that was kind of the thing. However, in the lead up to the Grand Prix, Adrian said that he will, and I quote, probably join another Formula One team, which is fun. Again, all parties involved in the split at Red Bull worked very hard to sort of downplay all of this, but I think Red Bull can start panicking now. Moving on, there are some big personnel changes at Ferrari in the lead up to the Imola weekend. Loic Serra and Jerome D'Ambrosio are coming over to the team from Mercedes. Uh, Loic will be head of chassis performance engineering. So basically, a part of the technical staff, he'll work on basically helping the car go fast. Um, and then D'Ambrosio, it will be deputy team principal. He will basically report to Fred Vasseur and Fred Vasseur only. And it's worth noting that D'Ambrosio, particularly, is kind of a fun career. He drove for Virgin and Lotus in 2011 and 2012, and then raced in Formula E and Brazil stock cars from like 2014 until 2020. He was effectively Toto's unofficial number two, but now he is becoming Vasseur's official number two, which is kind of fun. And it's worth noting that both men are on gardening leave until October of this year. But also on the Ferrari personnel side, Xavi Marcos is no longer Leclerc's race engineer. He is being replaced by Leclerc's performance engineer, Brian Bozzi. Now, this is kind of a big deal. Marcos has worked with Leclerc since the Sauber days. However, there have been an increasing number of kind of high-profile and rather fractious team messages over the radio, and one can't help but wonder if perhaps the two are related in some way, shape, or form. There was the radio message at Coda about track limits, which made Leclerc think that he had lost his pole position lap, but as it turns out, it was actually related to Verstappen. And then there was this thing during the Chinese Grand Prix a bit more recently, this year's Chinese Grand Prix, for clarification, where they were talking about trying to figure out something about like his line, Leclerc's line in turn 7 and 8, and like or try original lines, but it was all very confusing, and Leclerc didn't understand, and so they were getting rather confrontational and adversarial with each other, which is always a little bit concerning when that kind of thing happens. But moving on from that, Albon has signed, and I really hate this, but a, quotes, long-term deal with Williams. So, again, we don't know how long it's going to be because that seems to be the convention for these things, is that they don't publicize the length of the contract anymore. But seems like he's going to be sticking around at Williams for the foreseeable future. Now, amusingly, there was a bit of hand-wringing about whether or not this was ultimately the correct thing to do. Albon has got talent. I know he really got broken down when he was at Red Bull during COVID, and he himself replacing Pierre Gasly. So I guess that would have been summer break 2019, if memory serves, up through basically the end of the COVID season, so the end of 2020. And, just there was lots of talk about that, but he's come back with Williams and done so very, very strongly. I know this is the first deal he's really gotten to negotiate himself because Red Bull actually did it on his behalf when he signed for the team last time. So we'll have to see. Of course, the conjecture is probably minimum 4 years with an option or clause of some sort for either Williams to get rid of him or for him to leave Williams if the car is stinky. But we'll just have to sort of see what that holds. But moving on in the news cycle things, there was a bit of information that I forgot last time out that was actually rather important. But that being said, given that when I'm recording this is, still very, very topical. So in the run-up to the Miami Grand Prix weekend, one Mr. Mario Andretti was invited to Capitol Hill after a dozen representatives signed a letter calling for more information on Andretti Cadillac's rejection by Formula One management and Liberty Media. And this was amid concerns that F1 was exhibiting, quote, cartel-like behavior. Now, of course, I've talked at length about sort of the initial blow-up with Formula One Management, Liberty Media, rejecting Andretti Cadillac from the grid for 2025, 2026. Basically going, and we will let you in 2027? It's 27 or 28. Pinky swear. Certainly, that information was fresher in my head then. So go have a listen to that episode. It was actually kind of a packed one. It had me, JT, Baraka, and Caleb all on that episode, and it was frankly, it was just a really good time. But at any rate, sort of the cliff notes to that is that basically the teams are being super greedy, don't want to share prize pool and commercial revenue. So even though the FIA had opened a bid to allow teams in, and which there were a bunch, because it was like High Tech and Rodin and Andretti Cadillac. There were a few others, but Andretti Cadillac was the only one to get the thumbs up from the FIA. But then FOM and Liberty were like, actually, slow down there, buckaroo. And so we've arrived at quite a bit of an impasse. However, that bubble might be about to burst. Representative Jim Jordan, who is an Ohio Republican, and also chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, sent a separate letter, actually, directly to Greg Maffei and Stefano Domenicali, CEOs of Liberty and Formula One, respectively, demanding answers. And there's some spicy quotes in here. In this letter, Jordan called Andretti's rejection pretextual, arbitrary, and unrelated to Andretti Cadillac's suitability to compete in Formula One, which that is quite the zinger. But it is absolutely correct. He also feels like he and all of the sort of folks involved in this, because it is worth noting that even though Jim Jordan is a Republican, this does have bipartisan support. But it's broadly felt that the FOM and Liberty's behavior, or perceived behavior, I guess more accurately, violates the basically American sporting antitrust agreements, which is also noting that the House Judiciary Committee, wow, that is really difficult for me to say today, legislates on that directly. They are in charge of this kind of stuff. The, in my opinion, botched antitrust basically lawsuit filed against Microsoft to block Activision, the merger between Microsoft and Activision Blizzard. That was the House Judiciary Committee. And so on and so forth. But yes, basically violates American sporting antitrust, which is kind of a big deal because that's a whole, even relative to other types of antitrust, when you start talking about sporting league antitrust, it's its own set of things, and something that House Judiciary Committee is always going to keep at least one eye very firmly trained on. But also, he felt like the general behavior amounts to collusion. Jordan would go on in this letter to say that limiting basically the teams, or the amount of teams in Formula One, will, quote, increase the price of sponsoring or buying into an existing team. And that if F1 must, quote, hinder competition and harm consumers to protect failing competitors, then the entire Formula One model may be broken, end quote. And that if that's the case, then F1, quotes, cannot hide behind the necessity of a sports league to pursue anti-competitive conduct, end quote. And I guess we'll just unpack a little bit of that. The whole thing about, potentially this being a harm, to consumers and American consumers, that's, admittedly, that as a concept is a little bit nebulous. I went through and read the letter because, well, I do these things. I swear I've read more legalese and sort of bureaucratic red tape since starting this show than I have, I think, like the entirety of my life. It's like this is supposed to be a motorsports podcast, but I'm reading various government documents. But all merriment aside, the whole idea is that with the harming consumers, it's that it is harming American consumers specifically because it is strongly implied, though not explicitly stated, that the rejection of Andretti Cadillac will harm the general interest of basically American enthusiasm towards F1, be it on a purely casual level or even amongst the hardcore fans. And to be fair, he's onto something. I mean, we were all on Twitter when the rejection was initially announced. By both FOM filed a joint statement with Liberty, and then Andretti chased with their own later. And the amount of people who are like, well, Dustin, hands off, I'm done with F1 forever. There was a lot of that. But then also the idea of this whole failing competitors rather bit is that it's based on kind of the idea of that people or most teams aren't regularly challenging for wins. And that was a very, very crucial part of the original rejection statement that was issued by Formula One management back in January, whenever that was that was published. I mean, right now you basically have three teams that are in the running for a win: Red Bull, Ferrari, and McLaren. But everybody else stinks. But yes, and like I said, given that sports league and sporting antitrust is a very different thing from general antitrust. As you see, the House Judiciary Committee is looking at this rather closely, and to that end, Jordan requested a rather detailed summary of both physical documents and communications between Liberty and Formula One media that led to the decision to reject Andretti Cadillac. Basically, if it was any mention of either Andretti, Cadillac, GM, or some combination thereof, Jordan wants it. FOM and Liberty had until May 21st to respond to the letter. Now, as of the time of this recording, it is Thursday, May 23rd at 5 minutes to 8 o'clock in the evening, and there is no word currently floating around publicly on if this deadline was met or not. However, not meeting the deadline could result in some stiffer action from the House Judiciary Committee, and then sort of from there we'll kind of just have to see what happens. No real word on quite what we're going to get there. So, as with what feels like everything on the news cycle side this season, just going to have to stay tuned and, update accordingly. But moving back onto on-track stuff, the Imola weekend marked the 30th anniversary of what is widely regarded as the blackest weekend in F1 history. Of course, it is famous, or I guess rather infamous, for the deaths of both Roland Ratzenberger and Ayrton Senna. But it's also worth noting that Rubens Barrichello had a massive smash during, I guess, what would have been the equivalent of Q1 that weekend in 1994. And so he was knocked unconscious. He had a broken nose and a few other injuries that resulted in him not taking part in the remainder of the weekend. But of course, the young Austrian Roland Ratzenberger, he drove for the then very new Simtech team. That was actually their very first year. He was killed at a crash at Acqua Minerale during Q2, ostensibly, due to basilar skull fracture, ruptured aorta, and another very severe injury. And then Senna on lap 7 at Tamburello during the race due to a basilar skull fracture. And of course, Senna had the Austrian flag in his car with the intent to pay tribute to Roland after he won the race. So a memorial effectively was held. Of course, you saw that photo of all of the drivers dressed up basically in kit that looked like Senna's helmet. And Sebastian Vettel made a cameo and drove Senna's 1993 McLaren MP48. Took it through some over some laps as a bit of a tribute. So, and certainly, I don't have my partner with me, so the let's start a dialogue is going to be a bit thin, but there is something to be said that it very much feels like, Roland's memory was very much lost in the noise of Senna's death, which I think is a real shame. Roland was a very, very talented young man who ostensibly had a very, very bright future ahead of him. Even in that garbage Simtech, he managed to, at a round earlier in the season, he managed to not only pre-qualify, but he qualified and then I think finished the race 11th, which is it's worth noting that given the points format at the time, it's not like P11 today where it's like, oh, you're right on the cusp of points. P11, I mean, you were still miles away because points were only granted up to 6th at that time, if I remember correctly. But yeah, he was immensely talented, and all he needed was really another year and or a better drive. And I think he could have been a real staple of F1. Definitely a life taken far too soon. Both were, even Senna. But with that, we move on to proper on-track action for the weekend. So, FP1 started out rather auspiciously when Albon brought out a red flag almost immediately due to a undisclosed mechanical failure. At the very least, I couldn't find out what it was. But something broke, and they ended up having to pull the side of the road. It didn't take very long to get the car cleared before the session could resume. But Ollie Behrman was in Kevin Magnussen's Haas for FP1. And this being the first of 6 scheduled FP1 runs for Behrman this season. Of course, he made his absolutely sensational F1 debut, subbing in for a indisposed Carlos Sainz, who was recovering from appendicitis and the consequent appendectomy that comes with that. And he finished in the points, because I think he ended up finishing P8 that race. Now, it's worth noting that this was certainly some rather challenging conditions. Actually, the conditions would be challenging all through the practice and qualifying sessions because it windy. Yeah, it would, and there was a big crosswind, particularly on the back half of the circuit, roundabout turns 12, 13, 14, 15, and it was catching out all kinds of drivers who were making either excursions into the gravel, particularly at 15, or just going for spins altogether. Hamilton would be one that would spin as a direct result of the winds. But Leclerc would top the session and do so rather comfortably. And then moving into FP2, it was not great going for the Red Bulls. Verstappen would struggle for grip. And in fact, he would end the session P7 just ahead of Perez, who was P8. Lewis was being a bit of an obstacle in FP2 for reasons unclear to me, as both Alonso and Verstappen would encounter him at moments deemed inopportune, both of them being rather grumpy about it as a result. Leclerc would again go very quickly and would top the session, but it would close up as he was less than 2/10 ahead of Oscar Piastri, which is kind of fun. And then FP3 is where the metaphorical wheels would kind of fall off this thing. Alonso straight up binned it at Ravazza, which would bring out a red flag, and actually only the first one of the session. And then at the base of the dying breaths of FP3, Perez would also have a massive accident at this time at turn 15, which would bring out another red flag. And then the car would get cleared and the session would be restarted with only 2 minutes remaining. But then something interesting would happen. The McLarens would top the timesheets, with Piastri going fastest and Norris only about 3/10 behind. And then with that sort of sets the stage for qualifying. Now, it's worth noting that this would end up being a Verstappen pole, but he didn't come by it easily. Given that Piastri was less than 1/10 behind, it was 74 thousandths, I think. Or, sorry, 74 ten thousandths, rather. Though Perez could somehow only manage P11, he had set a time initially making it through to Q2, but he just couldn't improve. And then whatever that pace that Ferrari had in the free practice sessions, it would just evaporate in qualifying. Leclerc and Sainz would end up P4 and P5 respectively, with them being basically leapfrogged by Verstappen and both McLarens, which were P2 and P3, Oscar Lando. Now, Alonso would make a Q1 exit. He was actually scored last for a time before Logan would have a lap time deleted. Well, his lap time deleted. You know, there were some question marks over the condition of the car, given that he binned it in FP3 and kind of late in the FP3, and if they were going to be able to get the car in proper running order to make quali, and it seems like not. Both of the RBs would make it through to Q3, with Tsunoda out-qualifying Daniel Ricciardo yet again. Both the Mercedes made it through to Q3. Russell P6, Hamilton P8. Now, granted, Lewis almost ended up in the Q1 drop zone there for a sec. So it's just another weekend of kind of iffy pace from that car. But then Hülkenberg would go and round out sort of the top 10, being 10th. And then, moving on to the race, to start the race, there would be a bit of a grid reshuffle. Piastri would end up starting P5 after it was deemed that he impeded Magnussen, giving K-Mag a taste of his own medicine, quite frankly, in Q1, so a 3-place grid drop for that. And then Alonso would end up starting from the pits after making suspension changes, which of course violates the making tweaks to the car and parc fermé, blah, 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 blah. So he would end up starting dead last. Now it's worth noting, start was clean, because of course it was Verstappen and Lando on the front row, so kind of a repeat of Miami. The Mercedes consolidated P6 and P7 actually pretty quickly, with the DRS train forming behind Hülkenberg, who was able to make up some spaces and get himself up to P8. Albon would actually stop for hards on lap 10, but the wheel nut wasn't tight, and it forced Albon to come in and make another stop, basically make an additional stop to get the wheel nut tight, and they would actually end up switching to mediums that time, and then also get themselves in trouble for an unsafe release. So 10 out of 10. It's one of those issues beget issues. But this would trigger a cascade of pit stops with Alonso, Ricciardo, Tsunoda, and Hülkenberg all stopping within about 4 to 5 laps of that. Hülkenberg attempting to go long to try to cover off Tsunoda, who he was racing for position, which didn't work, by the way. Alonso's wild weekend would continue with his front brakes catching fire after leaving the pits on his stop. Unsure if it was something in, the front brake ducts or right around where I guess the disc and the calipers meet. But it was just an almighty jet of flames, which was, kind of funny, frankly. But around this, Verstappen would kind of bugger off into the distance. He was another one that went kind of long. And he had stretched his lead to over 5 seconds on Lando by lap 15. But that being said, by about lap 21, he was reporting that the front left tire was, quote, hurting. The Red Bulls, part of why the weekend was so difficult is that they had really been struggling with getting the car keyed into the tires, which is funny because the previous iterations on this generation of Red Bulls has traditionally been pretty kind to its tires. But he would do that. Lando would come into pit not too long after that and would dump out behind Perez and sort of shuffling the order of basically the top 5. And then Leclerc would pit shortly thereafter, with Leclerc very briefly being the quickest car on track, and that was around about lap 40. But then Lando found some pace, and basically the Red Bull beat the absolute dog snot out of its tires again. And as a direct result of which, in the basically closing about 15 or so laps, 15, 20 laps remaining in the race, Lando started to hunt down Verstappen, pushing very, very hard because Lando was on hards, and hards that were also slightly older. Again, given the tire wear issues the Red Bull was having, it was probably wear was a wash, but he arguably pushed a little bit too hard and cooked the tires, but was able to back off for a couple of laps, let them return a bit, went back to work, and what was at one point more than 6 seconds difference between the two cars ended up being less than a second at the line. It was 7/10. Now, unfortunately, as a result of which, it means that going back to back with maiden win and the next win is not a stat that Lando will notch. However, a P2 is very, very good. With Lando even saying that he was hoping not only just a win for himself, but just for the team to continue to ride this momentum into the Monaco weekend. But we're getting a little ahead of ourselves. We'll talk about that in a second. But overall, running order, it would be the top 10. It would be Max, Lando, Charles, who would round out the final podium spot, Oscar, Carlos, Lewis, George, Sergio, who was able to make up a couple of spots, but just, again, seemed to have a real devil of a time with the car, really through the entirety of the weekend. Lance would actually bag himself some points. He would end up P9, and then Yuki would round out the final points-paying position, denying Hulkenberg the pleasure, who would end up P11. And that just about runs us through the race weekend. It's Imola, so it's, kind of hit or miss with sort of action. Of course, it's more fun when it's raining, but also not very much fun when it's so much rain that, the whole local area is flooded, which is what happened last year. And so we didn't have an Imola weekend as a direct result of that. But at any rate, like I kind of alluded to a couple of times, coming up, we've got the greatest, Motorsports Christmas, as it is affectionately nicknamed on Motorsports Twitter. Because you have the Monaco Grand Prix in the morning, you've got the Indy 500 in the afternoon, and then you've got the Coca-Cola 600, which is the only race in the season with 4 stages, in the evening. So it'll be kind of a big day. And of course, we will be here to cover all of it. JT and I will be back for Monaco and Indy. And then, of course, on the main side, Jarrett, Art, Carl, they will be around for the Coke 600. So I guess with that, thank you so much for listening. I have been your host, Danny, and this has been an episode of Chicanery. Until next time.